everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on Measles outbreak. We have our world famous speakers. When any critical topic comes, always I want to give thanks. Professor David Smith actually give analysis and thoughts on the new and critical topic. Today's topic also very new. But good thing is that if we can learn from today's sessions, maybe we can take any precautions, take any strategy from emerging economy. First, I would like to give chance, Professor David Smith. What is your analysis? What is the present situation of this outbreak? What you want to share and how we can take different kind of precaution?
Well, thank you, Sharif. This topic is a real interesting one because the world has tried for a long time to try to eliminate measles. It's so infectious. Someone who has measles, it's estimated that there's a 90% chance that they will infect other people around them. So extremely high transmission rates of measles. And measles can cause a lot of different physical elements in the people who are around it. Right now, if you look at what's happening in the world, there's measles outbreaks. And what a measles outbreak means is there's much more disease than expected from the trends. And they're really looking there. And you can also see when you're traveling, measles are a real interesting statistic. And COVID-19 actually has increased the risk of measles outbreaks. Over 61 million doses of measles-containing vaccines were postponed or missed because of COVID and the delays in that and people not going to the doctors and stuff. So what we're seeing now is a reaction globally to these 61 million doses plus of measles vaccines that were not administered. And let's just kind of go back and for a second or two, look at where this is happening. It's happening globally, but the top 10 are kind of interesting. The top 10 are India, Yemen, Somalia, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Liberia, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Angola. Those are the top 10 countries in the current measles outbreak. And in India, there's over 12,000 number of cases so far this year. And that's really an appalling statistic when you think about this as a disease that is 99% preventable with a childhood vaccine being administered to them. So it's actually reaching proportions where globally we're seeing this spreading. Here in the United States, for example, in Ohio, since school has restarted, there have been a reported 92 cases of measles there, which is well above the normal one that they would get at all. So you see, it is spreading. Also, measles can happen anywhere in the world and be transmitted. With today's transportation-centric global society, it's easy because measles can enter through infected travelers who are coming through it or travelers returning from other countries. In 2000, United States, there were only 31 states that had measles reported into it, and so that's really a very interesting number as you are beginning to look at this globally. There have been a lot of studies, particularly ones the whole in the World Health Organization in the South and East Asia region. They've actually put a proclamation out wanting to try to look at how to eliminate measles and rubella by 2023. And they're actually going backwards from the time they released this proclamation for that region. And this was done in 2019. And 2019 was not a bad year in the region. 2020 was not, but 2021, 2022, and now going into 2023, we're seeing increases in the whole Southeast Asia region of measles. And in particular, as you begin to look, like I said, India is one of the leaders right now globally in this measles outbreaks that are happening there. Um, it's good to step back though and try to put your head around what's happening. Uh, Globally, the reaction to the COVID-19 vaccines, that there's conspiracy theories around it. There's theories of the government trying to manipulate citizens with it, which has actually put many vaccines in jeopardy. I know a bunch of my friends right now are not taking the flu vaccine because they're just afraid of what's happening with the vaccines right now. So this anti-vaccine movement, at least in the United States, but from where I've talked with my global friends, I believe it's a global one, is impacting this. Also, because of COVID and because of the new COVID XDD 1.5 variant, uh, people once again are afraid to go out to doctors' offices. They're afraid to go to clinics where you would get these vaccines. So that the COVID whiplash is coming back against this and is being effective in reducing the amount of people who will even go and take the vaccine. Um, the United Nations, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, uh, the Red Cross in the United States Center for Disease Control, and I can keep this list going on and on. Just recently published a report on measles outbreak strategic response plan, and the outcomes from here is they believe that this measles is going to be very severe around school age kids, and that very possibly, just like COVID did, schools might have to shut down and not have students go there to help control the outbreak of measles, because it's the youth who are the most targeted when you look at these measles outbreaks. And there might be the ability to go back and to school lockdowns again, where the kids would have to stay home and go back to the same type of teaching regiments that were in place before. The World Health Organization and UNICEF are really trying to work with governments, non-state actors, NGOs, to put a framework in place, particularly for the developing nations right now, to go and try to go back and plug this gap. Personally, I think the problem is going to be just as big here in the United States. I know a dozen friends who've decided they're not going to get their kids vaccines anyways. So if a case of measles breaks out in their school, the likelihood of them being infected is extremely high. And I think that is a global statistic on here. Uh, if you begin to look that we're also needing to produce more and more vaccines right now, just like when COVID broke out and the vaccine was developed, it took a while to manufacture enough to be distributed. We're beginning to see some of the same things before, and we need to see it not just in the ability to meet the standard demand, but because people have not been vaccinated the past several years, going back and having to meet that demand as well. And like I said, you have to develop not just the vaccine, but a strong support containment around it. How do I deliver it? How do I get there? An education component. So many of the things we talk about, education is part of the key. Public awareness is part of the key. And with a measles outbreak like this, that is surely part of that going further. Uh, and particularly what the United Nations and UNICEF and is trying to do is look at how under the national health regulations, which came out in 2005, it talked about how do you strengthen the local communities in developing nations? How do you strengthen them to where that there's adequate uh, infrastructure, adequate nurses and doctors to deal with this? And how can you strengthen the primary healthcare systems, the ability to be immunized and the preventive services around it? Um, just like we saw during COVID, uh, a lot of the world doesn't have the disease surveillance and outbreak preparedness that is necessary here. During the start of COVID, and I hate comparing measles to COVID because they're very different, but they share some common characteristics with what we're seeing now. During the outbreak of COVID, during the early part of it, we did not have enough resources to bear to track how many cases were where. And we're doing better at the national scale, but not at the local scale in many of these countries. And having to go back and see and how can we invest in a way that we can go back and handle it. Let me just go back to where I was on this one. Like I said, the numbers are just really surprising to me as you look at it. With, like I said, India with over 11,000 in this newest outbreak, um, and you can see them anywhere. The goal of centers like the CDC, U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, it says a framework's in course. You need to find the measles quickly to stop the breakouts. You need to analyze the data and provide that information, help support decision making, such as uh, do I do self isolation? Do I impose more rigid guidelines? Do I need to set up a vaccine clinic, maybe in the schools, uh, for children and their parents to come to? How do I plan and implement a response campaign? How can I find and move resources to where they are most needed? And to really confirm all this, you need to have a robust laboratory system. And a lot of the world just really does not have that together to itself. For example, in a story on this out of Nepal, uh, it interviews over 25 parents who said their children have never had any vaccines in their life, and this is how it seems. So once again, we go back and talk about a couple of the other statistics around them. Like I said, measles is a threat anywhere in the world, particularly where people are not vaccinated before. Measles is one of the most contagious diseases. And, looking back at COVID, we understand how contagious diseases can be spread, and measles is more contagious than COVID was. Uh, like I said, a person who has measles has above a 90% chance of infecting people around them who are not immune or vaccinated against the disease. And it's really kind of interesting. According to the World Health Organization, since the year 2000, over 23 million lives have been saved from dying from measles because of the vaccines which have been out there. And the vaccine, the measles vaccines is over 98% effective at preventing infections after the recommended 2 dose, and 93% effective after just 1 dose. And you're seeing that. The uh, UNICEF actually warned this summer what they saw is that we're in the largest sustained decline in childhood vaccinations for over the last 30 years. So this is really going to make the possibility for outbreaks uh, much more of a threat, and it's inevitable. And the World Health Organization and the US CDC have published joint warnings that the measles outbreaks they're seeing globally pose an imminent threat around the world and called for urgent global action. And in their announcement, they noted that the situation is severe. So that is kind of setting here, pulling it up together. And according to the World Health Organization, last year, measles caused over 128,000 deaths, primarily in children under the age of 5. And it's kind of senseless if we have ways to eliminate it. And it makes economic sense as we look at that too. In the United States, a single measles outbreak in 2019 in Washington State infected 72 people. And it is estimated that that cost $3.4 million. And this was out of a report published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Um, and to make this even worse is that because of COVID and all the variations of it, um, and the fact that the healthcare practitioners, many of them are burned out. Many of the emergency rooms are full. Many of the hospitals are full. Uh, and so that makes the response to this even harder. And even trying to get your children in to do a routine facility like a vaccination is increasingly tough. I wanted to take my son in who had the flu to get some medicine for that. My doctor here said that with the backload they have now, they are booked solid for the next 2 months, and the first appointment they could get him into, since it was not life threatening, was over 2 months out in front of us. And I think we're going to see that globally from what I've heard. I would love to hear uh, from Dr. Talley on how that's being handled in his country and how it's being done others. But we really need to look at how do we support the World Health Organization, United Nations, UNICEF, and others in their measles and rubella initiative, and how we can do that. How are we going to work to prioritize worldwide? This is a worldwide challenge because of how our world is today. How we're going to prioritize worldwide the vaccine efforts to keep everyone safe and going around the world with this. I was surprised when Dr. Sharif sent me the notice of what the topic was last night, because I've seen a few things in the news about a measles outbreak, but what is capturing most of the news is the new variation of COVID, the XBB 1.5 COVID, because of how fast it's spreading, how the existing COVID vaccines do not work with that one. That the measles outbreak, which is very severe, is kind of lost in the noise. And that's what I think, Dr. Sharif, makes your program today even more important, is to get a little bit visibility, to move it above the noise level that's out there with the COVID coverage, with the war in Ukraine coverage, with other things like that, we have such busy news cycles that's hard for something like this to achieve appropriate coverage. Um, what else? In Mumbai, the huge outbreak there. They're having children die in the 1 to 5 years. And in there's and the Mumbai government is really offering free costs now to everyone who wants to go and get the measles vaccine. And I think you're going to see this scale more and more globally uh, as you try to look at how can this be countered. Um, let's see, where's the other one on this part? Uh, the specialists there really have said that the incidence is on a steep growth plan there of just being infected, much less being dying from it. But measles is so highly infectious, it's controlled by the measles virus, which can last 7 to 10 days post infection. And that causes concerns because in those 10 days, uh, you can infect anyone around you and get there. Also, kids who have not been vaccinated have increased chances of dying as compared to kids who've not been vaccinated. So again, a lot of work being called out for that. And like I said, India is the one which is kind of highest at risk right now, is there. And if you begin to look at the second big region around that, Africa is tremendously at risk right now, and are looking at how they can put efforts around that to hold it off some. Let's see, where's the others on there? And once again, measles is transmitted from fluid from the nose, mouth, or throat. So even having people wear masks, and I hate to say that because I do not like wearing masks, but even wearing masks in areas where there is a measles outbreak should help you, particularly the people who actually have the measles, and put them there. And the other characteristics we've seen is not only is there a low vaccine coverage, people are just not taking the vaccine, but floating populations, the fact that we are so mobile, and the mobile economy makes it even worse. There's a lack of public awareness about measles today. Uh, and there's an apathy really in government agencies trying to look, how do I plug these loopholes behind the measles in all these different countries? I tell you, I can see it here as well. Uh, in that uh, you just see it going backwards with all the criticism of the early steps taken with COVID, with closing whole cities, schools, factories, the government, restricting travel. Governments don't want to do things like that again. Uh, and there's a rapid surge, though, in the number of unvaccinated kids, which are going to impact this. Immunization coverage globally is always low in the rural community. It's always low in the developing nation communities. And it's actually trending very low now in big cities as well, for many of the reasons we talked about before, because like the lack of wanting to do vaccines. Last year, I did not get my flu vaccine just because I did not want to go to the clinics and stuff. Uh, and it impacts you. I mean, you can kind of tell I'm stuffy today, and I'm catching a cold, and I'm really hesitant to even go to the doctor on this one and get a Tamiflu or something that can help head this off. But Sharif, those are some of my initial thoughts, and I hope I'm taking in the direction you wanted. Uh,
Excellent, excellent. No, definitely. This kind of discussion actually really helpful because this is very new for us. Country like Bangladesh, India, or South Asia, it's very, very new. Even our board of advisor, Mr. Patan, he and his family has COVID, and it's heavily affected his family. So this kind of dialogue
right.
actually help us to create awareness. So what do you think? When actually this COVID will be abolished, or it will be finished, or what do you think?
Well, so you asked about COVID. The problem with COVID is it is a very high level morphological virus. What do I mean by morphological? Is the virus itself keeps changing itself. It keeps morphing into something different. And that's what makes it hard. Um, the original COVID, for example, attacked your lower lungs and areas like that and had characteristics. Then when the Omicron, and there were several versions of the early COVID, um, then the Omicron versions came out. It was that virus morphing, changing itself again to the Omicron versions. Uh, those did not attack the lower lungs. They attacked the upper respiratory system uh, and were a little bit more easy to transmit, but they were not, the mortality rates were not as high as they were with the original COVID. And now we're seeing this, this new XBB variation out. And it is very, very contagious. Um, the normal COVID treatments that were effective for the original COVID and the Omicron are showing not to be as effective against this new variation of COVID. And there's already, it has morphed into a couple of different versions. Um, and the existing um, COVID vaccine, according to the preliminary test, is not effective against this new XDD variation. Uh, the XDD1 and the XDD 1.5, and there's now an XDD2 that is beginning to populate. I can tell you here in Texas, as of this last weekend, 71% of the new cases of COVID in Texas were the new variation. Uh, now, we're still working on the clinical portion of this. It looks like the modality of it is a little bit higher, that people get a little bit more seriously ill. Some of the interesting characteristics is with COVID, you often lost your sense of smell, you often lost your sense of taste. This new variation of COVID, you do not. But to directly answer your question, when is it going to be over? I think that COVID is going to become more like the common cold or flu. Uh, and that some variations of it will be around for quite a while because it is a very active virus that keeps changing itself to protect itself. Um, and you will see that where when we go back to the original topic of this program, the measles itself does not change its variations that much. So it's a more stable one where early vaccines, pre-elementary school vaccines can have a huge impact on eliminating most of measles. Uh, in in almost 100% in people who are vaccinated. Yeah. So I think that answers your question, Sharif.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent discussion, and especially this kind of dialogue will be really helpful for creating awareness. And we are trying to do so in emerging economy. So this is very important. Uh, Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Uh, Measles are a preventable disease. I don't think we will ever see it 100% eliminated just because of the nature of people and the fact that people want to travel, people want to do things, people do not like going to the doctor, people do not like shots, uh, and all of those areas. But part of what you need to do is you need to look at how do I coordinate when you do have outbreaks like this measles outbreak. How can I enhance my local, my regional, my national, my global coordination of how to train this and track it and be prepared for it. We need to look at ways to effectively communicate and educate the status of measles vaccines because everyone today is beginning to compare any vaccine to the COVID vaccine. And that vaccine is very, very different, very different. Uh, but how do we respond? How do we recover from what's out there? You need to look, like I said earlier, about identifying these outbreaks early, taking actions there before they can spread much further. And how can you do it in a place where there's cost savings for the states, particularly the developing nations? Uh, how can you look at to collect the data? Because you use data to identify priority countries for strengthening their response to measles outbreaks, and then go to the ones where they have not had it yet. And it takes data to do that. And broaden the approach across the world for the ability to fund this and to control it. And, you know, according to the United Nations and one of their studies on this, is if you can control a measles outbreak within the first 14 days, it will be confined to that one region. And that is one of the most strong things you can do is identify it from using the data and collecting the data early, take immediate actions, and and look at how to handle that. The peak measles outbreak globally actually was in December, and that's why it's trending up this year too. And that's kind of where we're there. And there's gaps. There's gaps in coordination. There's gaps in planning for a response, getting the drugs out, making sure we have enough drugs. Uh, there's gaps in administration. There's gaps in how you administer those outbreaks. And the real big gap is in laboratory because you want to go ahead and have laboratories in place to do this. And our laboratories are already stretched thin with COVID and the amount of testing COVID takes. So the final thing on this part of it is there's a risk of communication and community engagement. Uh, you know, we've talked already about the communications challenge because people don't trust vaccines right now. Uh, People don't understand about the severity of measles. Measles can kill kids, and it does all the time. I mean, you heard me earlier say that there over 150,000 kids last year were killed because were died because of measles. And how do we put the training in place? How do we put the doctor and the laboratory management systems in place to respond to this? Measles is at a disadvantage now, even in funding for vaccines, because of the amount of money which has gone in to fund the COVID vaccines. Uh, and that further makes this challenge even harder to achieve globally. Uh, but Sharif, I hope this has helped. Uh,
Mhm.
as a non-doctor, you're pushing my credibility a little bit on this one. But as someone who understands global healthcare and global healthcare challenges, uh, you can see that this is one I really had thought living here in the United States and seeing that our normal measles population is low hundreds. To the rising tides we have right now, I'm surprised because there just was not adequate coverage to let people know, which I think is probably the same situation globally. So, Dr. I think that's my concluding remarks.
Thank you. This is excellent discussion, and I want to give a special thanks to Professor David Smith, because when critical issues come, you always take the lead. You always come alone and take the lead. Some point I know it's very difficult, but this is important dialogue that we are working for emerging economy. We have a lot of challenges. Even some point, we have gap for
We do.
understanding the situations. So definitely your help will be helpful for millions of people in Asia Pacific. Thank you, Professor David Smith, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum.
Well,
Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
thank you.